I'm Mandy McLeod. Welcome to Straight Talk. Coming up, will forestry farmers be robbed of valuable carbon credits under a new government proposal? And what about those swarms of Asian bees across the ditch apparently threatening our biosecurity here in New Zealand and our $5.1 billion bee industry? Are they really wild, invasive and impossible to eradicate? Meantime, across the ditch, are new stresses for Aussie farmers the same ones that Kiwi farmers must confront too? Joining me in the studio is Lab Wilson, consultant for Bats Incorporated. Welcome, Lab.
Thank you very much, Mandy. It's great to be here.
Lab, Straight Furrow reports that a new government policy for carbon credits is for forestry farmers of less than 100 hectares is going to create a second-class citizen for forestry farmers. What do you think about this?
Doesn't seem very fair.
It doesn't, does it?
To cut out the little guys, does it?
No, especially when they talk about the fact that those farmers who've got less than 100 hectares are those guys potentially on better soils and have generally more carbon sequestration, and yet are going to have to take a monitored value, not a measured value. Can you think of any other industry that this happens in?
No, I can't. I'm at a loss, really. I don't quite understand why they've done this, but it's hard to fathom why they would want to try and cut some people out of the spoils, so to speak.
Do you think that's why not a lot of forestry farmers have yet signed up to the new carbon credit system?
I guess it is. It's quite a big problem. I heard the other day that there's a huge percentage of farmers who just haven't got round to it yet. Perhaps there's a lack of motivation there.
What do you think the government needs to do to increase the motivation then, given that we've got our protocols to meet under Kyoto?
Well, perhaps they need to talk to these people and find out exactly what it is they have the beef about and what could be done to allow them to measure it properly.
Well, my understanding is that the measurements are there. They've just put a cut-off in the line and said 100 hectares can measure. Below 100 hectares, they have to take a predetermined value.
Made by somebody else, I presume, which is hardly seems like an equitable position, does it?
No, no.
What they can do, I don't know. I'm not party to the machinations of government, really.
I don't think any of us really are. Speaking about government policy, in Australia at the moment, Asian bees, which have been causing quite a bit of problem to the honey industry over there, these are wild bees that appear to be untamable and potentially hard to eradicate. The Australian government has pulled the pin on their eradication policy from an apparently unscientific decision. And at the same time, Damien O'Connor has called the government to beef up our own biosecurity regulations to prevent the Asian bee coming into New Zealand. And yet the government is saying that the onus has to go back onto the beekeepers. What do you think about this?
It's a pretty big issue. I mean, what did David Bellamy call us? Noah's Ark. I think, personally, we're all in this together. So the free trade issue, the free trade agreements cut both ways. And if we want to have free trade, then we have to accept things like food imports and tourism, both of which carry a big biosecurity risk. So my belief is that, yes, the government does need to support and beef up biosecurity, but at the same time, perhaps some of the individual industries need to take a proactive approach to preventing or designing measures to prevent incursions into their own industry, because after all, there's only so much the government can do. I think our current biosecurity system seems to be very good at waiting for a response if we do have an incursion. Certainly in the area of animal health, I know there's a huge infrastructure that will be activated if there is an incursion, but preventing them, I'm not sure that we're doing enough about that.
Moving on from that, Lab, in Australia, and I've just come back from there, the Australian farmers are feeling more and more stress from the climatic impacts, the government policies around water and mining. Given that they're now talking about doing some mining at Raukumara and other parts of Northland, how far away do you think New Zealand farmers are from being put under the same stresses that our Aussie cousins are impacting?
Hard to say. I guess there seems to be moves to free up mining resources on dockland, etc. So perhaps farmland may be under threat the next. I don't believe that this government, anyway, the current government would be silly enough to try and do something like that, because I think they would lose a lot of votes, and it's not about to happen in the near future. That's a personal opinion.
Yeah. So you think that the New Zealand government's got potentially a stronger focus on the environment than what the Australian government appears to be displaying at the minute?
Yes, and also I think they understand it would probably be suicidal in terms of getting into power next time. So.
Oh, fingers crossed, because I'd hate to see what's happening there happen to us just over money. Okay, coming up after the break. Ongoing delays because of the PSA infections are causing kiwifruit farmers immense frustration. In Australia, cotton growers face a double whammy, not helped by those devastating floods. And a new report by the Ministry of Agriculture and Tupuna Kokore paints a bleak picture of Maori freehold agricultural land in New Zealand, claiming the majority is underperforming. Stay with us for more after the break. Welcome back to Straight Talk. Joining us now is John Stewart from Sector Report. Now let's talk kiwifruit. It appears that some kiwifruit growers still haven't been informed about whether they've got PSA infection or had written confirmation about PSA infection in their orchards. John, what do you know about this?
Well, what I do know is that I recall we on Sector Report went down to the Bay of Plenty at the time it all broke out, and I seem to recall it was kind of late November, so we're talking nearly 6 months ago, aren't we? And it seems an incredibly long time for an industry that's so vital for us. You'd think the biosecurity guys would be in there, and I guess it's Zespri running it. Is it Lab or is it
I'm
Kiwifruit
not sure
growers?
about that. I think it's
or MAF.
I believe it's Zespri, that they're still
Yeah.
waiting for
Zespri.
Zespri to give them written confirmation.
Well, you wonder about their resources, don't you? Really?
Yeah.
When biosecurity is so important to us, particularly in that industry.
Well, especially when they're filling boats as we speak to send over there. I guess maybe the resources are limited. But you think as a grower, because they can't get compensation, can they, until they've had this written confirmation?
So this is a problem with the diagnostic procedure, or is it? We don't understand that, do we? Why?
No.
What the delay is about? Is it could be?
No, it just appears to be a
it
delay.
could be technical in the diagnostic. I don't know a lot about the
Nobody seems to.
the methods they use, but
No.
they must have ways of making a positive diagnosis, and so perhaps that's
You'd think so as a
one of the
grower
things that there's
sitting
a delay there. Because I mean, in this electronic age, doesn't take long to send out a report, does it?
Well,
No.
that's right.
No,
Exactly.
you'd think so.
It's hard to see where the hold-up is, although the picking season is upon us now, isn't
it's
it?
well and truly.
So
yeah.
would that be a reason, I wonder, for a bit of a delay? Hard to see why.
I don't think so.
I mean, all they've got to do is take some
Just
leaves, for goodness sake,
Yeah.
and put them
Increases
under a
the
microscope.
urgency, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, exactly.
Now, moving on from our kiwi fruit, we've seen poor old Queensland and Australia suffering massive rainfall events. I know that in North Queensland this year alone, they've had 3 metres of rain.
Wow.
And it's wiped out a lot of the cotton crops up around Theodore and Emerald, and that the sugarcane industry is in complete strife as well, because they can't get on and harvest. Adding to this, allegedly our good friend Monsanto, who charge a fee for the GM seed, are not letting growers off the hook who have paid for a per hectare levy to grow their GM crops. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, why would the growers not want GM crops, I guess, is the first question. Why would they want to be let off the hook
Sorry,
if they're
John,
already happily growing GM?
what's
cotton?
happened is they've lost their crops, so they have to pay per hectare for the use of Monsanto's GM technology.
Oh, for the crops they've
For
lost.
the crops they've lost.
Ah, okay.
And
Well,
they-
that does seem a bit heavy-handed, and let's face it, Monsanto's record and heavy-handedness is well established.
Yeah.
It's not exactly customer focused, is it? But I mean,
No.
there are parallels. Microsoft, Apple, people like that make sure they try and tie people up into their
Yeah.
way of doing things. So it's, I guess, a little bit the way of the world.
Do you think, given that Monsanto have got a monopoly on GM in the likes of Australia, and I guess this attitude that we're seeing, do you think it's another reason why New Zealand should sort of stay GM free?
Absolutely. And I have to just remark in passing, I'm very surprised to hear that Australian farmers are using GM, genetically modified crops.
Oh, you'll find very little crops, wheat,
Conventional.
canola, that are conventional. Very little. I was talking to a grower who said that they tried to do, I think it was 40% of their crop without GM. And they've slowly had to move up because they were trying to kind of, I guess, hold Monsanto a little bit accountable for the fact that they're the only player and wanted, but they can't. You know, mainly to do with the pressure from growers, from other growers around them and the town people of the sprays. So it's got less to do actually with the fact that there's greater production and some of the benefits they're talking about, but it's actually around consumer perception.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's classic monopoly behaviour, isn't it, really? And surely that's a very big red flag for us. No, stay away from it. We're at the mercy and beck and call of enough of these big international organisations without needing Monsanto added into the mix.
Well, John, talking about the big corporations, what I found when I went to the Darling Downs, and this is really scary, is that Queensland government has sold the mining rights to the coal seam gas.
Right.
All throughout the Darling Downs. Now, like in New Zealand, Australia's got, farmers have got no ownership of what's under their soil. And so the real fear there is that the companies that they've sold it to, which I believe are PetroChina and Shell, a Dutch Shell, can come in at any time and access that farm and start doing exploratory digging.
Open cast?
No, it's not actually open cast, but what they're going to be doing is pulling the water out and with salt.
Dalby and the Surat Basin is home to some of Australia's prime agricultural land, but it's also the hottest new market in Queensland's $100 billion coal seam gas industry and open cut mining, which has got a lot of farmers really worried.
We've got both. We've got like a third of our farm is potentially going to be an open cut coal mine and destroyed forever, and the rest of our land is all subject to coal seam gas activity. We're lucky to date we haven't had any wells drilled on our farm, but the whole of our area is destined to be drilled.
To access the gas, first they have to drain the coal seam of water.
And this water is very saline, and it's also fully allocated under the Great Artesian Basin Water Resource Plan. So every bit of water they take out of the coal seams to access their gas is going to have an impact on somebody else in the Artesian Basin.
Coal seam gas sounds great. It's easy to say it's clean and green. It's half the emissions of petroleum when you run your car on it. Let's have a look at the ecological footprint of this thing at the production end, and until you can satisfactorily answer what you're going to do with 1 million semi-trailer loads of salt and how you're going to prevent the destruction of the Great Artesian Basin, we think you should cool your heels a little bit.
At least mining, you can see what's happening. You can see, the impact they're having. It's very localised. It's there. The problem with coal seam gas is there's so many unknowns. We don't know what impact it's going to have. And they do. They promote it. They say, look, we're not digging it up. You guys can come back in here in 20 years' time and everything's going to be fantastic. But, we've got two huge issues with it. One's the salt. They're potentially creating a huge environmental problem in 30 years' time. So there's no real management plan for that. And the second thing is our underground water.
And so there's going to be this huge salinity issue and piles of salt lying around, and no one seems to be talking about it.
It's already an issue in Australia.
Oh, it is, in the
soil
Murray-Darling.
salinity, isn't it? So
Yes.
you think they would be acutely aware of that sort of problem? Yeah.
You would. And it's interesting that water is salty water. I mean, we all know about it down in the Murray-Darling Basin in Victoria and New South Wales, but in North Queensland, I'm surprised to hear
No, this
that.
is not. This is the Darling Downs, so this is like southeast Queensland.
Oh, southeast. Sorry, yes,
Yeah.
it is too.
Okay.
It's a very large area, though.
It's
isn't it?
huge, yeah. And it's
Yes.
one of the the best growing, the best soil areas in Australia, just about. And from what I was told, the Queensland government have given carte blanche to these organisations to make any environmental damage, and they'll fix it up. Can you imagine that happening in New Zealand Lab?
Oh, no, not. Given our discussion we had before the break about the government not being suicidal, I doubt it, but I guess it's something to be aware of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess farmers, if they're going to pull the environment card, need to be careful that they're squeaky clean in the way that they need to walk the talk. If they're going to pull this is going to hurt our environment, then they have to be sure to be.
Yeah.
to
Well,
be
I
seen
mean,
to be
That's
clean.
an interesting issue,
and
though.
I think you've got to bear in mind the plans by the state coal, what are they called? Solid Energy, in partnership with, I think it's with Ravensdown, isn't it, to mine this lignite in Southland over under very valuable dairy land. I mean, is that going to be open cast? Are they going to burrow under the ground? What sort of environmental damage could that do to, and of course a lot of that country is converted to dairying now, very valuable land.
I think to me what it's about is actually the regulations. We know that we've got to have some mining. You know, there's too much valuable resources and our countries are in so much debt. But it's actually, surely it's about saying, let's be sensible and put some environmental parameters about it. You know.
Absolutely. I mean, we have the science to do it.
Yeah.
We know quite a lot about all of this, and there's plenty of precedents in other parts of the world. So surely we can tap into that knowledge and use it.
And also, of course, you've got to remember that, like Pike River, for instance, is on DOC land too.
Yes.
And DOC laid down some very hard and fast rules there, so maybe we can learn from that when it comes to freehold land, farming land.
Talking about freehold land, there's been a new report out by the Ministry of Agriculture and Te Puna Kōkiri saying that some 60%, or it might have been 80% of Māori freehold land is underperforming.
That is a worry. Actually, on Sector Report in the next week or so, we will be running a story which looks at a highly successful incorporation of several different trusts in the central North Island, just sort of based on Mokai, just north of Taupo. And that's a huge success story, and they're farming about 2,000 cows, I believe. Then you've got the trust that based in the Wairarapa, who were
Wairarapa Moana.
Yeah,
yes.
Wairarapa Moana, who were shifted because of the lake that they wanted claim to. Finally, they agreed and they got shifted to Mangakino, hundreds and hundreds of k's away. But some of those entities are doing extremely well. But you're dead right. I mean, if we look past them, there's still, I think you're right, 80% of land is underperforming. And of course, the problem is we've got the traditional Maori whānau, hapu, iwi structure, and thousands and thousands of shareholders. So of course, getting agreement on what to do with the land can often be very difficult.
Lab, I know that Peter Sharples put up that very argument, but you've worked in the agriculture sector for a long time as well. If you can do it with the likes of Wairarapa Moana and some of the other incorporations, why can't we do it with all of them?
I guess John's probably hit on one of the reasons is that there's a lack of agreement amongst.
But if some organisations can do it,
cooperative ownership, and I guess there's got to be motivation in the first place. If the motivation's not there, then nothing's going to change. If it's there, then surely the expertise and the aid or the help can be brought in and help them to do this. But if they're not motivated, then we need to find out why not.
There was another argument that they brought up, was that Māori aren't very good at bringing in non-Māori resources. And maybe that's something
I would doubt that.
I
think historically, right from the exchange of the first musket, for goodness sake, they are and always have been a very commercial people. And if they can see a trade opportunity, they'll grab it. I just suspect that possibly one of the problems for these Māori entities is the ability to raise capital is limited because of the multiple ownership.
Yes, I mean they can't borrow because they can't. The land can't be sold, so it can't be used as an asset.
Okay.
But I mean, I certainly know in my limited experience working with some Māori corporations is that they are very focused on employing Māori where they can, even sometimes when that's been to their detriment. And I'd like to your views on this. Do you think if we held up all New Zealand freehold land, how much of that do you think would be underperforming?
Very good question.
Like, is this just Māori?
Yeah, it's a very good question.
What is performance? What level do you benchmark it against? I mean, I have this idea that this current surge in commodity prices, especially in the meat sector, may be the downfall of New Zealand farming instead of the saviour, because it's just reduced the motivation to get better. I think you're right. I think there is an underlying complacency there, and that's just going to continue.
It certainly is my huge concern. I mean, I even look at our farm, for example, and it's not performing where it should be. So I wonder how much.
Tut, Mandy.
I know. I think my focus is obviously in other places. but I guess what it highlights to me is, do we place too much focus on this differentiation between Māori and non-Māori farming? You know, they do this report and say, oh, it's terrible. But what about the rest of farming?
Indeed, but I think we do need to be mindful that the Maori are operating in a different context.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I think it's a very valid point. I mean, drive around the central North Island hill country and there's plenty of patches of scrub that could be cleared away and some trees planted to stop the erosion, and the land could be, more productive, I'd have thought.
Yes.
Do you think there might be a perception that lower key, less intensive farming is more environmentally friendly and therefore more sustainable? Because traditionally Maori people are more married to the land in a cultural and a spiritual way. So I mean, maybe there is a spiritual component to this as well.
Very well.
Yeah, and it's a really good point, Lab. And that I haven't read the report, so maybe that comes up in it. But I think it certainly warrants a further look, and a look potentially across the board at the underperformance of New Zealand agriculture. Because I tend to agree with you, Lab, about wallpapering over the cracks because we've got high commodity prices. Thanks, guys. Coming up after the break, we ask our guests what's made them sit up and take notice. Find out if it will be a rant or a rave. We will tell all after the break. Welcome back to Straight Talk. It's time now for our weekly rant or rave. Righto, Lab, I can see you sitting there waiting to give it to us. What have you got?
Well, I've given it a wee bit of thought, and I have to go back to my Wormwise days.
Let's go back a bit.
Because the problem of drench resistance has not gone away, but it seems that farmers are doing what I call this ostrich farming. Their heads are buried in the sand. They don't want to know if they've got drench resistance or not, because they would rather not know. And I used the analogy in the Wormwise days about an oil tanker headed for a rock in the middle of the ocean, and these things take about 15 miles to change course. So if you see the rock when you're 7 miles away, forget it. But if you're 20 miles away and you spot the rock, then you can do something about it and take evasive action. So I would encourage farmers to find out what their drench resistance status is on their farms, and then they know whether or not they have to take action or whether they can carry on farming the way they are.
It's a very good rant, Lab. I like that one. Johnny, what have you got for us?
Well, I've got a bit of a rave actually, Mandy. We at Sector Report went down and covered the New Zealand Dairy Business Conference in Rotorua a couple of weeks ago. That has morphed, I believe, from the 2020 conference, it used to be called, and I think it's driven by the Large Herds Association. It would have been fascinating to total up the wealth of all those people in that room. They were the big heavy hitters in New Zealand dairying. And some very interesting speakers, including a couple of offshore dairying entrepreneurs. A guy called Mark Townsend I talked to, he's running a very large operation in Chile, which happens to be on about the same latitude as Palmerston North, with so a very similar good wet climate and all the rest of it. So they're running New Zealand stock, well, New Zealand genetics, I should say. And they found, there were a few little tweaks they had to make, but surprisingly, Chile was a very hospitable place for them to set up in business. So they're running around 20,000 cows at the moment and aiming within the next 7 years or so to get it up to 50,000 cows, which is an amazing feat. The staff are mostly local Chileans, but there are Kiwis there as well, but some very senior administrators, and of course they all have to be fluent in Spanish, which has been one of the problems I understand with Farming Systems Uruguay. The Kiwis that went over there went, oh, well, she'll be right, they'll all speak English, and of course, imagine if you went down to Waikato and expected people to speak Spanish. So they've had a problem there. These guys, it's all Spanish, and very successful. Another fellow I talked to was Simon Wallace, who operates on the other side of South America in Brazil. Yes. In tropical Brazil. And he drove, I think he said to me, he bought or hired a car and travelled for 150,000 kilometres. This was about, I think, 10 years ago. Finally found the place, still in the tropics, but with the right microclimate, so that it's hot, but not too hot, and there's not nearly the humidity you normally associate with the tropics. So the grass just, as he described it, the tropics as the Ferrari of biology.
Yeah, he's done a very successful business set up there. He's probably more successful than anything that's actually coming out of Chile, from what I understand.
He's got the local market tied up for fresh milk.
Yes.
So they're not having to process
And labour,
even.
yeah.
And labour.
Yes, no, he's done a really
And
awesome
again,
job.
Portuguese speaking, they're all Portuguese, they have all their meetings in Portuguese, so that's really important.
It
to
is
make the thing
important.
go.
Thank you very much, guys. That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. Lab and John, thank you very much for coming in. That wraps up our latest edition of Straight Talk, brought to you by Straight Furrow. I'd like to thank again my guests, Lab Wilson and John Stewart. Thanks to you too for watching. Remember to check out my blog online at country99tv.co.nz. I love hearing from you. Catch you next week, and in the meantime, keep on talking straight.